the ties between U.S. and Mexico. So what about Canada? Canada is not going to be as important. It's a third of the size of Mexico, roughly. Talk about Canada then for a moment, if you don't mind.
I don't want to suggest for a moment that Canada doesn't matter at all. Let me rephrase that. I totally love suggesting that Canada doesn't matter. But the key thing to remember about the United States-Mexico relationship is we have different skill sets. We're good at different things. We're good at different price points. And whenever you're doing a manufacturing system, you need different labor skill sets at different price points. And the border region is perfect for that. Canada, not so much. Canada's quality of work is very similar to the United States. Their cost of labor is very similar to the United States. And so Ontario can integrate with the lower 48 like it was a 49th state, and that's not nothing. But the room for growth is limited because it's not taking advantage of a dramatic change in the international environment like Mexico will be. Canada is simply an already integrated part of the American economy. Mexico is filling a need that we haven't had until very recently.
And they have the labor,
Yes.
and Canada not so much, right? Their
Canada is
population
kind of
growth,
topped out.
right?
The only way we get fresh labor into the Canadian system is immigration, and they're the world's leader at attracting immigrants on a per capita basis. But they're also on a bit of a treadmill because they bring in people in their 30s and their 40s who drop a lot of cash, buy some property, distort the local markets, and then, especially recently, move on. So we've had a huge amount of Chinese capital go in and distort Canada to the point that a lot of people in Canada can't, or sorry, a lot of people who were born in Canada can't afford to live in Canada. But the Chinese that come in are dropping their money but not working there. So they're getting all of the distortions and none of the advantages to the labor market.
So it's somewhat similar to the Chinese decamping for Australia, right? They're buying expensive real
Would agree.
estate
Yeah.
in Sydney, but in Canada it's in
Yeah, the same
Vancouver.
thing happened in New Zealand. And so the Kiwis and the Canadians have now barred foreign purchases of their property. Australia and the United States at the present have not done that. So we're going to be seeing a little bit more concentration of that kind of distortion in some of the gateway markets.
Gotcha. So, we've covered Mexico then, but actually, I want to ask about we talked about this when you were here in Austin, just briefly. It has hallmarks of a failed state because of the narco problem, right?
Yeah,
And
no. I would argue at least half of that is our problem because we really love our cocaine in this country. And
yeah,
as long as that is the case, there is going to be a smuggling route for the cocaine to get in. And the cartels are a very serious threat, and they're becoming more serious. So the background. The Sinaloa cartel has been the most powerful organized crime group in the world for several years, and they have crossed north of the border. And under the Obama administration, they were identified as public enemy number one. And El Chapo, their leader, became our most wanted person. And after a lot of back and forth with the Mexicans, we captured him. He escaped. We captured him again. And now he's serving out multiple lifetime prisons. He'll never see the light of day again. And the Sinaloa cartel is starting to disintegrate. In many ways, that's a problem because under El Chapo, it was run as a business. Cocaine smuggling is what they did. And so you didn't engage in side businesses. You did not corrupt local government. You did not shoot the locals or rob the locals because that would encourage people to turn against you. With El Chapo gone, that's kind of fallen apart. It's become a lot more violent, starting to fracture. And a new faction, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, is rising up, and it is hyper violent. And the first thing they do when they move into a town is shoot a bunch of people, and they run cocaine on the side. They are in the process of challenging the other cartels for control of all the plaza access points on the border. And if they manage to successfully cross at just one of them, well, then white chicks named Debbie and Dallas are going to get shot. And our view of Mexico and the drug war is going to change dramatically in a very short period of time.
you said cocaine, but it also fentanyl and opioids. I mean, this is the other big part of the influx of contraband from Mexico into the U.S.
Yeah, I don't mean
And
to suggest that those are not important. They
yeah,
are, but the sourcing for that is very broad based. The Mexican cartels are only part of the constellation for the supply of those.
gotcha. So, but to bring it back to that idea about then the violence and I've watched it from a distance. I don't speak of any of this firsthand, but it just seems that this violence and the lack of rule of law, or to put it a different way, the strength of the cartels in many of the provinces in Mexico. This is a problem, but you're saying that the maquila industry and the other industries that are industrial that are going to be important to trade for the U.S. can be somewhat immune from that failed part of the Mexico state. Is that a fair way to put it?
Immune might be a bit strong. Part of the problem we're facing with the
Insulated, maybe.
Yeah, I'd agree insulated. Part of the problem with the cartels is that in northern Mexico and in southern Mexico, you've got a topography that is relatively difficult for governments to control. So in the north, you've got a highland desert. In the south, you've got tropics. It's just difficult for states to push their writ in areas like that. That's one of the reasons why central Mexico has, as a rule, been less violent. In that sort of environment, especially when the cartels consider drug running to be their primary source of income, there's nothing that says that it has to overlap with traditional routes. Because if you've got one guy with a backpack with 20 pounds of coke, that's a lot of cash. He doesn't need a container to do that. You can have the two operating side by side with a degree of insulation, and the violence itself is usually never more than 1 or 2% of the physical land area of the country at any given time. So if you got a security team with your operation who knows how to keep their ears to the ground, they can figure out what's coming and when to shut down and who not to deal with, and it can be managed. The challenge moving forward is if Jalisco really does get control of a plaza, the plazas are where the licit goods transfer through, and that's too close. El Chapo and the Sinaloa use those, but they don't interfere with trade because they realize it would be bad for their business. El Mencho and the Jalisco new generation cartel would probably have a very different operating strategy.
And when you're talking about the plaza, you're talking about the Zocalo, the center of the town. You're talking about that they wouldn't operate, the cartels won't be on the fringe of town.
Specifically the trade arteries where they cross the border.
Okay, so the plazas you're talking about. Okay, so the access points to get into Texas or into California would be the choke points. What you're saying? So if they control or start to control those border points, then it's a different story.
Yeah, right now they're contested, and most of the violence, almost all the violence, is on the south side of the border. But if they do seize control of one and they have unrestricted access to the United States, that would threaten trade. Now, when you've got a cartel with one dude at the top who's calling all the shots, it's kind of like what's going on in China. If Xi were to die tomorrow, you would have national disintegration in a short period of time because there's no other source of authority. It's the same with Jalisco New Generation. So if El Mincho were to slip in the shower and fall on some bullets tomorrow, the forecast changed.
fall on some bullets. Just slip and having to be executed by an AK-47. Yeah, well, that's an unfortunate shower event. The other key theme we talked about here in Austin, but is also a key theme in your book, is the idea of the Blue Water Navy and the U.S. Navy and its importance to global trade. I had another guest on the podcast, and now I'm bringing it up, and of course I'm forgetting his name. Right, Easterbrook, his book on the Blue Water Navy in the U.S. was really important and talked about the evolution of the U.S. Navy. One of your thesis points that you're talking about in the book is that the U.S. Navy is no longer going to be the cop of the global oceans. Has anything changed since in the interim to make you think that Congress is going to appropriate enough money for the Navy to have more than 300 ships that would bolster the Navy to bring it back? What's your thinking on that lately?
No, and even if Congress did, it wouldn't matter. So if you want to patrol the ocean blue for commerce in an environment where you are not the only Navy, you're going to need about 800 destroyers. We've got 70. So the naval buildup that would be required if that's a role we want to play is simply beyond something we could do in anything less than a 50-year time frame. So I suggest you put that out of your mind. Also, at the end of the Cold War, we decided to concentrate our Navy in terms of combat power into the supercarrier battle groups, of which we now have 11. And those are great for knocking off countries, but they're horrible for patrolling because they can only be in 11 places at one time, assuming they're all deployed. So even if we wanted to, we are now technically incapable of patrolling the global oceans. That doesn't mean that we're giving up the Navy, not even remotely. Our Navy is conservatively 8 times as powerful as everyone else's combined. And the world's second and third most powerful blue water navies are Japan and the United Kingdom. So, those 3 countries in terms of naval cooperation get along the best of any 3 navies in the world. So that 8-1, if anything, is probably closer to 15-1. but that is designed for combat power. It is no longer designed for global patrol.
So when you talk about that, you're specifically talking about piracy then, and the ability of the Navy to stop the stop piracy on the high seas, like offshore Somalia or other places like that?
Call
Is
it
that where you?
piracy. If a government is involved, call it state piracy or privateering. But yeah, we should expect to see a lot more of all of that.
So I had a a little brain mishap there, but the book is The Blue Age: How the U.S. Navy Created Global Prosperity by Greg Easterbrook. He puts forward a similar thesis that the importance of the U.S. Navy is hard to overstate in terms since World War II, which is a point that you make as well in your
Totally
book.
agree.
Um, but followed through on that. So is it going to be China being more active or belligerent in the South China
Nope.
Sea? What is
China
it?
might have 600 ships versus ours, but most of them are very, very small, and only 10% of them can sail more than 1,000 miles from the coast. And honestly, it's not even that good because that 1,000 miles assumes that they're going in a straight line and slow to save fuel. If they're actually maneuvering like you would in war, they can maybe go 350 miles from shore. It's a coastal navy. It is not a regional, much less a global one. And the country that is most dependent upon the Americans keeping the trade lanes open is China. So if they were to do anything so stupid as to challenge the US Navy, we would just park a couple of destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin, cut the energy line from the Persian Gulf, and the China would collapse as a modern state within 6 months. This would not be a hard war if it came to it.
Well, so then who's the challenge? I mean, where is this piracy? Where is this going to privateering?
Everywhere
From where will it
is the
come?
answer because the Americans are no longer supporting the system, and so you're going to get regional powers, whether out of desperation or opportunity, looking after their own affairs in their own ways. In the case of the Persian Gulf, that means the Saudis are probably the greater threat to the Persian Gulf than the Iranians are. We're seeing what's going on in the Black Sea with the Russians right now. And what does Europe look like in a post-German system? We've seen this movie before. It is not good for commerce.
So then what's the way forward then? If I mean, because you're painting a if one of the macro themes of the book is that we're going to see a lot of reshoring, and this is going to be good for the U.S. And there's a point you made during your speech here in Austin that this longer term is going to accrue to the benefit of the U.S., which I think is likely true because of demographics, energy supply, geography. Geography is destiny, a point you make over and over. But then who are going to be the big rivals then if China is falling, then who and Russia is weak now, who are going to be the principal rivals then for the US in terms of this next wave of growth? Is it going to be Vietnam? Who
Well,
would
the
that be?
primer on that is book number 3. That's Disunited Nations. And
Okay.
in that, I break down the countries of the future as we think of them now and explain why they're really mostly failed places and who the countries of the future are going to be. And we're going to have a series of regional powers that are capable of kind of creating a bubble of security in their own neighborhood. France in Western Europe, Argentina in South America, Japan in East Asia, and Turkey in the Levant. Of those four, since the book came out, the Japanese have found a way to cut a series of deals with the United States, both under Trump and now under Biden. And so basically, we're seeing a fusing of the theoretical Japanese sphere of influence with the greater NAFTA system. And I think before we get too far into this, the Brits are probably going to come along for the party as well. So you'll have a kind of a super system based in the Western Hemisphere that the Americans reign over, for lack of a better phrase, that we have the two secondary naval powers of the world that are participating in. And then you'll have these smaller chunks that have kind of melon scooped out their own neighborhood. And the zones in between them just become no man's lands.
Well, let's talk about the UK then, because I'm looking at the UK and following, what's happening, particularly on the energy side there. They look to me, I don't want to get too technical here, but totally screwed. I mean, just totally screwed,
You're
right?
being very charitable.
They haven't drilled. The heyday of the North Sea is long past, 15 or more years in terms of gas production. They now import more than half of their natural gas. Their electricity prices are through the roof. We're seeing deindustrialization happening in Britain as fast or faster than anywhere else in on the European continent. And yet you're pointing to you, as I'm hearing you, am I hearing you correctly, that you're still bullish on Britain over the long term?
Over the long term, I mean, they have to kind of get their heads out of their asses first. So when the vote on Brexit happened, they neglected to imagine what their next step was. They believed, the Brexiteers believed a little bit of their own propaganda that they could just come to Washington and get a better deal than they got with the EU. And when they tried that under Trump, they discovered it was not true. And in order to get a free trade deal with the United States, they basically had to sacrifice control of their financial, manufacturing, and agricultural system. On January 5th of 2021, they swallowed their pride, like, okay, fine, we'll sign. And they sent their emissary over to sign deals on January 6th. And other things were in play on January 6th. And then
Right.
Biden comes in, and Biden is not nearly as pro free trade as Trump was. So it's in the wind still. Basically, Britain has done what has happened to Britain is what it always feared. It has devolved into a middle power that doesn't have any leverage. And until such time as they accept that, like the Japanese, they've got to cut humiliating deals with both the left and the right in the United States. And it's got to be the same deal. Until they accept that, they're kind of stuck in this no man's land. And it's difficult for them to leverage what they do have to reshape their future. And in the meantime, everything that they had about the old European system is falling apart piece by piece with increasing speed. And that leaves them in the lurch they're in now.
And I mean, this could be it could be very uncomfortable and destabilizing, couldn't it? I mean, we're already seeing, if the projections are for energy poverty, even this winter, or if we look at next winter,
Yeah,
where
and the
you're
more
having,
desperate the situation is, the faster we will get to a political reckoning in London, which will lead them in time to admit that their only future is as part of the NAFTA system. But they've got to get there at their own pace. But reality is pushing them there very quickly.
what is that line that a friend of mine put it? They need some market therapy. Was that the,
Well, I mean, the markets have been very kind to the UK to this point. They've taken 6 years to make a decision. And it wasn't until just this past year that the markets are really like, we're kind of done waiting.
right? Which was why we saw the pound fall so far. And then
Now, don't get me wrong, Liz Truss made some mistakes,
right.
but that was the culmination of 6 years of mistakes.
Let's talk about trust for a minute, because I wrote a piece recently in Real Clear Energy about, I think it was there, I've forgotten where I published it, but about Rishi Sunak coming in and reversing Truss's ban on, or lifting the ban on hydraulic fracturing. It's like they can't figure out what is in their own interest, and they have enormous shale resources, but they have to drill and they have to frack. And yet here was a Tory leader saying, Truss saying, we're going to repeal the ban. And then Sunak, she's only in power for 6 weeks. Sunak comes in, immediately reverses course. How are you ever going to develop shale gas in Britain if you have the Tories saying we won't drill?
Well, one, we haven't had the political break that'll force all of this to be reshaped yet. And in that sort of environment, it is at the moment in the UK politically unpopular to frack. And it's not so much the technology, it's the land ownership issues,
Right.
because the government owns all the subsoil rights. And so if somebody comes into your house and says, I'm going to frack in your backyard, and you don't get a cent from it, obviously you're going to be opposed. You do that in the United States, you get royalties.
Right. Yeah. No, that's right. And they're having the similar conflict over onshore wind and in Britain as well, which is something I've written a lot about, the conflicts over land use and wind and solar siting. In Austin, when I heard you speak here, you said, I'm quoting, I think pretty much directly, you said, we could easily have $150 to $180 per barrel crude. And you talked about the January 1st, the sanctions expand and prohibit any Russia. Well, I guess it's the insurance issue on Russian vessels that are carrying Russian goods. Talk about that, if you would, please. Why do you expect higher oil prices, and what are these sanctions effect on Russia? Why are those kicking in? When they kick in, why will it have such a big effect?
So, in a normal energy project, when the price drops too much, they shut in production.
Right.
And then they restart it later. And no one likes to do that. It costs something, it costs time, and you're not getting income in the meantime, but it can be done. But you can't do that in the Russian permafrost. If the crude stops moving through the permafrost layer for any reason, it freezes into gel, and the water that comes up as a byproduct freezes into ice. And when water turns into ice, it expands and it pops the pipe from the inside. What's going on right now is the insurance ban on Russian vessels on January 1 will expand to any vessel carrying any Russian cargo. And at the same time, the Europeans are about to enact their ban, saying that no Russian crude whatsoever can be sold by any boat to any European market. And that is going to force a degree of shut-in the ports. The pressure will build back up to the wells, and then the wells will freeze solid. That's going to happen pretty quick. And since the demand for energy tends to be inelastic, you get an outsized price response. So, assuming for the moment that all else is equal, and I realize that is never true, you remove 4 million barrels a day of Siberian output, and you're going to get $180 oil. Now, that was my forecast when I saw you last time. Since then, the Chinese look like they're going out of their way to experience an economic crisis. And if we see a drastic decrease in their ability to absorb crude, that's going to change the price forecast. There's so
Sure.
much in motion right now, but none of it is great.
Well, so then let me follow that up then. So it's a question I have ask of a lot of guests. And you're long the U.S. That you've made that very clear. I am as well. I'm a homer of the first order here. But where does a smart investor then put money these days? Is it, I've had people, gold bugs, and, we see what's happening in crypto. You have a chapter, and I've heard you talk about the US dollar. It's still, for all of its flaws, being the best currency in a terrible global neighborhood of currencies. So, where are you putting your 401?